Picture this. The year is 1185 BC. You are in the royal palace of Ugarit, a wealthy port city in modern Syria. You're not looking at a sunset, you're looking at a scribe running for his life. His hands shake violently as he jams a reed stylus into a wet clay tablet. He isn't writing poetry, he is carving a death warrant. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. He doesn't finish checking the grammar. He throws the tablet into the kiln. He needs it to bake hard immediately so he can send it to the king of Cyprus. He needs an army. He needs a miracle, but the miracle never comes. Archaeologists found that tablet 3,000 years later. It was still in the oven. The city of Ugarit fell, the walls collapsed, and the fires of the invaders finished baking the clay. The scribe died waiting for the tablet to dry. This single object freezes the exact moment the lights went out. This is the Bronze Age collapse. It is history's most terrifying murder mystery. 8 distinct, flourishing civilizations didn't just decline, they were extinguished. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this, and please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Now, we need to understand exactly what died in that oven. Drop the preconceptions of primitive tribes banging rocks together. The world of the Late Bronze Age was a mirror of our own. It was sophisticated, interconnected, and wealthy beyond imagination. If you walked the streets of Hatta in Turkey or Thebes in Egypt, you would see international diplomats arguing over border tariffs. You would see merchants checking shipping manifests. You would see a world locked in a tight embrace of commerce. We know this because the ocean floor tells no lies. Off the coast of Turkey, we found the Uluburun shipwreck. This wasn't just a boat. It was a floating FedEx truck of the ancient world. Its cargo hold contained a staggering checklist of globalization: copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, glass from Egypt, ebony from Nubia, and amber that had travelled all the way from the Baltic Sea in Scandinavia. Think about that supply chain. For a single bronze sword to exist in Greece, a miner in Afghanistan had to dig up tin. A merchant had to transport it thousands of miles across mountains and hostile territory, a sailor had to navigate the Mediterranean, and a smith had to cast it. This was the global economy 1.0. The great powers of this era, the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Assyrians, operated like a club of CEOs. They ran the world. They exchanged letters complaining about late shipments and asking for doctors to cure their eye infections. They married each other's daughters to seal trade deals. King Hattusili III of the Hittites even signed a peace treaty with Ramses II of Egypt that included an extradition clause for political refugees. This level of international law feels incredibly modern. They had stability, they had centuries of prosperity, they had the arrogance to believe it would last forever. But this complexity was a trap. By tying their economies so tightly together, they had created a system with zero redundancy. They built a machine that required every single part to work perfectly, every single day. Consider the resource that named the age: bronze. Bronze is an alloy. It requires copper and tin. Copper was common. You could find it in Cyprus, which is actually where the word copper comes from. But tin? Tin was the oil of the Bronze Age. It was rare, strategic, and absolutely essential. Without tin, you have no bronze. Without bronze, you have no weapons to defend your city, no tools to harvest your grain, and no luxury goods to trade. The tin routes stretched thousands of miles into Central Asia. If a warlord in the Zagros Mountains decided to block a caravan, the price of weapons in Greece skyrocketed. If a storm sank a fleet off the coast of Crete, the economy of Egypt stuttered. Historians often point to 1177 BC as the tipping point, but the collapse was not a single event. It was a domino effect. The system had become too efficient for its own good. Leaders optimized for wealth, not resilience. They centralized power in massive palaces that acted as distribution centers. The king didn't just rule, He was the chief financial officer. Farmers brought grain to the palace, and the palace redistributed it. This meant that if the palace fell, the people starved. There were no local markets to fall back on. There was no plan B. So when we look at the scribe in Ugarit throwing his tablet into the oven, we are looking at the final failure of a just-in-time delivery system. The enemy ships were the final blow, but the patient was already sick. The immune system of this globalized world had been compromised by decades of subtle shifts that the kings ignored. They were too busy building larger monuments to notice the fault lines opening beneath their feet. We're about to walk through those fault lines. We will track the disaster as it spreads like a virus, jumping from the fault lines of the earth to the hungry bellies of the poor, and finally to the shores of the Nile. To understand how this apocalypse unfolded, you have to look closely at the weapon in a soldier's hand. A Mycenaean warrior standing on the ramparts of his citadel didn't hold a piece of iron or steel. He gripped a short, leaf-shaped sword made of bronze. This metal gave the era its name, but it also sealed its fate. Bronze is a demanding master. Unlike iron, which you can dig out of the ground in almost every country on Earth, bronze does not exist in nature. It is an invention. It is a technological marriage between two distinct elements, copper and tin. The recipe is strict. You need 90% copper and 10% tin. Deviate from that ratio, and your sword either bends in combat or shatters on impact. Here lies the geopolitical nightmare of the late Bronze Age. Geology played a cruel joke on these civilizations. Copper was relatively easy to find. The island of Cyprus was essentially a floating copper mine. The name Cyprus shares the same root as the word copper. They dug it up by the ton, but tin? Tin was the blood diamond or the crude oil of the ancient world. It was rare, elusive, and desperately needed. The major civilizations of the Mediterranean, the Hittites in Turkey, the Egyptians on the Nile, the Mycenaeans in Greece had almost zero local sources of tin. To get it, they had to rely on a supply chain that stretched dangerously thin across the known world. The primary sources lay thousands of miles away in the badlands of modern-day Afghanistan, or even further, in the remote mists of Cornwall in the British Isles. Think about the logistics. For a pharaoh to equip his chariot corps, a donkey caravan had to trek through the Zagros Mountains, navigate the tribal conflicts of Mesopotamia, cross the deserts of the Levant, and finally reach a port to be shipped to the Nile Delta. Every mile added cost. Every border crossing added a tax. Every bandit raid added risk. This reality forced the ancient world into a state of hyper-globalization. Isolation was impossible. If you wanted to survive, you had to trade. This necessity birthed the palace economy, a system that centralized everything. The kings did not merely tax their subjects, they owned the entire economy. Picture the great citadel of Mycenae. It wasn't just a fortress. It was a massive warehouse. The archaeological records are filled with linear B tablets that read like Excel spreadsheets. They tally everything. 500 bronze arrowheads, 3,000 litres of olive oil, 20 wheelwrights. The palace dictated what you grew, what you made, and what you ate. Farmers brought their harvest to the citadel gates. Artisans brought their finished goods. The king's bureaucrats catalogued it, stored it, and redistributed it. This centralization allowed for incredible feats of organization. It allowed the Hittites to field armies of 10,000 chariots. It allowed the Egyptians to build the Ramesseum. But it stripped the common people of resilience. The average farmer had no savings, no private stockpile, and no autonomy. He relied entirely on the palace for his survival. He gave his grain to the king, and the king gave him back a ration of barley and a bronze sickle to harvest the next crop. The kings, meanwhile, grew addicted to the flow of international luxury. They treated diplomatic relations like a family business. The Amarna letters, a cache of clay tablets found in Egypt, reveal the petty bickering of these superpowers. The king of Babylon writes to the pharaoh, complaining that the gold sent to him was impure and demanding more. The Hittite king asks for a doctor to cure his infertility. They call each other brother, but they act like rival CEOs guarding their market share. They established a standard currency for this trade, but it wasn't coins. It was the oxhide ingot. These were massive slabs of pure copper, shaped like the hide of a skinned animal, weighing roughly 60 pounds each. They were heavy, standardized, and stackable. You could load a ship with hundreds of them. The Ugarit wreck carried 10 tons of copper ingots and 1 ton of tin ingots, the exact 10-to-1 ratio needed to create 11 tons of bronze. That single ship represented enough metal to equip a small army. The loss of that one ship must have been a catastrophic financial blow to whoever owned it. But imagine if the loss wasn't just one ship. Imagine if the route itself was severed. By the 13th century BC, this network had become too efficient. It had optimized away all the slack. The reliance on distant tin meant that the entire military-industrial complex of the Mediterranean hung by a thread. If the trade routes from the east were cut, the foundries would stop. Without new bronze, tools would wear out, ploughs would break, weapons would dull. The surplus that fed the palace bureaucrats would vanish. The kings of the late Bronze Age believed they had tamed chaos through administration. They believed that as long as the scribes tallied the ingots and the priests poured the libations, the system would hold. They failed to see that they had built a skyscraper on a foundation of sand. They had created a world where a crisis in Afghanistan could cause a famine in Greece. And the crisis was coming. It didn't start with an invading army. It started with the Earth itself turning against them. The planet was about to enter a period of violent geological and climatic upheaval that would test this rigid top-down system to its absolute breaking point. The kings could command armies, but they could not command the rain, and they certainly could not command the ground beneath their feet. The first domino was about to fall, and it would fall from the sky. The ground betrayed them first. For decades, archaeologists were puzzled by the sheer number of destroyed cities in the layers corresponding to the Late Bronze Age. They found fallen walls, crushed skeletons, and warped pillars from Troy in the north to the Levant in the south. For a long time, they assumed these were the result of warfare. But warfare leaves specific marks: arrowheads, sword cuts, looting. Many of these ruins showed something else: walls blown out from the inside, bodies trapped under rubble mid-stride, and foundations shifted by massive force. Geologists call this phenomenon an earthquake storm. The tectonic plates beneath the Mediterranean operate like a pressure cooker. When one fault line slips, it transfers the stress to the next section of the fault, triggering a chain reaction. Between 1225 and 1175 BC, the Earth unzipped. A sequence of massive seismic events rippled across the Aegean and the Near East. We're not talking about a single bad afternoon. We're talking about a 50-year period where the ground refused to sit still. Imagine the psychological terror. The ancients did not know about tectonic plates. To them, an earthquake was a direct sign of divine anger. The king's primary job was to mediate with the gods to ensure stability. When the palace walls crumbled, it wasn't just a structural failure, it was a theological crisis. The legitimacy of the ruling class shook along with the foundations of their citadels. But a civilization can rebuild after an earthquake. You can stack the stones back up. What you cannot fix is a sky that refuses to rain. While the ground shook, the climate turned hostile. For years, historians debated whether drought was truly a factor or just a convenient excuse. But recent hard science has ended that debate. Paleoclimatologists drilled deep into the sediments of ancient lakes and the floors of the Mediterranean. They examined fossilized pollen grains trapped in the mud for 3 millennia. The story told by that pollen is terrifying. Around the end of the 13th century BC, the pollen from lush forests and agricultural crops vanishes from the record. It is replaced rapidly by the pollen of dry steppe vegetation weeds and hardy scrub capable of surviving in arid wastelands. The data points to a mega-drought, a rapid climate shift that cooled the ocean surface and shut down the rains that watered the breadbaskets of Greece and Turkey. This was the death blow for the palace economy. Remember, this system was a centralization machine. The farmers gave their grain to the king, and the king redistributed it. The system relied entirely on a surplus, but when the rains failed year after year, the surplus evaporated. The warehouses in Mycenaean and Habiru stood empty. We have written proof of this desperation. In the final days of the Hittite Empire, the great king wrote a frantic letter to the Pharaoh of Egypt. The Hittites, once the most feared military power in Anatolia, were reduced to begging. The letter reads bluntly, I have no grain in my lands. Another correspondence is even more chilling. It is a matter of life or death. Egypt, blessed with the Nile, held out longer than the others. They sent charity shipments of grain north to their starving rivals, but even the Nile eventually dropped. The global food supply chain snapped. The combination was lethal. The earthquakes shattered the physical infrastructure, destroying ports and roads. The drought destroyed the biological infrastructure, killing the crops and the herds. The complex system we admired in the previous chapter turned into a trap. There was no resilience. There were no local gardens to fall back on because the palace had monopolized production. Hunger is a powerful motivator. A starving man does not care about the divine right of kings. He does not care about international treaties. He cares about survival. As the heat rose and the granaries emptied, the social contract between the rulers and the ruled began to disintegrate. The people looked at their high walls and their golden chariots, and they realized that their leaders could no longer protect them from the world. The palaces were no longer sanctuaries, they were targets. When archaeologists excavated the charred ruins of the Mycenaean citadels, they noticed a disturbing pattern. At sites like Tiryns and Medea, the destruction layers tell a specific story. The great palaces on the hilltops were incinerated. Their limestone blocks turned to lime by the intensity of the heat. But often, the lower towns, the humble mud brick homes where the commoners lived, were left relatively untouched. This does not look like the footprint of a foreign invasion. Foreign armies loot and burn everything. This looks like a revolution. We must reconsider the narrative of the barbarian at the gate. Before the first Sea People ship appeared on the horizon, the Bronze Age civilizations were already at war with themselves. The social contract was broken. For centuries, the deal was simple. The peasant surrendered his freedom and his harvest to the king, and in exchange the king provided physical protection and spiritual favour. But when the earthquake struck and the rains failed, the king could provide neither. The palace became a symbol of hoarding, not distribution. Imagine the rage of a starving farmer looking up at the citadel walls, knowing the granaries inside still held the last reserves of wheat, while his children ate boiled grass. The archives give us glimpses of this internal fracturing. We see references to a group called the Habiru. These were not a specific ethnic group, but a social class, the dropouts, the outlaws, the refugees who had fled the rigid control of the palace system to live in the hills. They were the loose atoms of the late Bronze Age. As the economy collapsed, their numbers swelled. They raided trade caravans. They cut the supply lines. They became a shadow army living on the fringes of civilization. In the Levant, we find letters from mayors begging the pharaoh for help, not against foreign kings, but against their own rebellious populations and these Habiru bands. The land of the king is lost, one letter cries. The threat was domestic. The destruction of the palaces likely followed a brutal logic. When the food ran out, the people didn't just starve quietly. They stormed the administrative centres. They targeted the archives because that's where the tax records were kept. They targeted the granaries to survive. They targeted the elites because the elites had failed them. In Mycenaean Greece, the violence was absolute. The linear B writing system, used exclusively by the palace bureaucracy, vanished entirely. It wasn't just forgotten, it was annihilated. The people didn't write for the next 400 years. This suggests they didn't just lose the ability to write, they rejected it. They associated literacy with the oppressive tax system that had bled them dry. When they burned the palaces, they burned the receipts. The great powers were rotting from the inside out. Their economies were shattered, their legitimacy was gone, and their populations were in open revolt. The immune system of the Mediterranean world had collapsed. And it was exactly at this moment of supreme weakness, when the walls were breached from within and the armies were scattered suppressing riots, that the horizon darkened. The final blow was about to land. The climate refugees we mentioned earlier were arriving. History knows them by a more terrifying name. The Sea Peoples were here. The final horror arrived from the horizon. For decades, the Sea Peoples have been the boogeymen of the Bronze Age. Victorian historians painted them as a unified, disciplined naval force, ancient Vikings who swept down from the north to pillage civilization for sport. But the truth carved into the stone walls of Medinet Habu in Egypt tells a much more complex and frankly more tragic story. Look closely at the reliefs commissioned by Pharaoh Ramses III. You see the warriors? Yes. You see the Shurden with their horned helmets and round shields. You see the Peliset with their feathered headdresses. They carry long, straight swords and fight with a ferocity that terrified the Egyptian scribes. But look behind the warriors. You will see ox carts, wooden wagons piled high with household goods, pots, pans, and sacks of grain. Walking beside these carts are women and children. This detail changes everything. An invading army does not bring its grandmothers and infants into the heat of battle. A raiding party does not pack its entire household. This was not a military campaign. This was a mass migration. The Sea Peoples were not just killers. They were the first great wave of climate refugees in recorded history. The same drought that was starving the Hittites and the Mycenaeans was also scorching the lands of southern Europe and the islands of the Mediterranean. These people were fleeing the same hunger that was eating the empires alive. They were a moving wall of humanity, desperate and displaced, pushing south toward the only lands that still had water and grain, the Levant and Egypt. Imagine the scale of this movement. It was a domino effect of populations. One tribe, displaced by famine, invaded their neighbour's territory for food. That neighbour, now homeless, moved south, displacing the next group. By the time they reached the borders of the great powers, they had coalesced into a loose confederation of the desperate. They were terrifying because they had nothing to lose. The great kings of the Bronze Age were prepared for formal warfare. They knew how to fight other chariots on open plains. They knew the rules of engagement. But the Sea Peoples didn't play by the rules. They fought with skirmish tactics, using javelins and long swords to slash at the legs of the horses, disabling the tanks of the ancient world. They cut the trade routes. They swarmed the ports. The correspondence from this time captures the sheer confusion of the elite. The king of Alashia, on Cyprus, wrote to the king of Ugarit, "Enemy ships have been sighted at sea." But before a defence could be mounted, the ships were already landing. These weren't strategic strikes. They were desperate landings by people looking for food. The tragedy of the Sea Peoples is that they are often blamed for the collapse, but they were largely a symptom of it. They were the vultures circling a dying animal. The system, that rigid, interconnected, top-down structure we discussed, was already shattering under the weight of earthquakes, drought, and internal rebellion. The Sea Peoples simply kicked down the rotting door. When they arrived at the great cities, they found starving populations and demoralized garrisons. In many cases, the local oppressed classes might have even welcomed them, or at least joined in the chaos to loot the palaces of their own masters. The wave crashed over the Levant, erasing city after city. Ashkelon, Hazor, Megiddo. They fell one by one, and now this tidal wave of desperate warriors and starving families was turning its eyes toward the biggest prize of all, the last bastion of stability. They were heading for Egypt. The dominoes began to fall in Anatolia. The Hittite Empire, the great rival of Egypt, the superpower that had mastered the chariot and stood toe-to-toe with Ramses the Great, simply evaporated. For a long time, historians believed Hattusa, the Hittite capital, was stormed in a glorious, bloody siege. But recent excavations paint a more disturbing picture. The royal palace wasn't filled with the bodies of soldiers fighting to the last man. It was empty. The precious items, the gold statues, the official records, the fine jewellery were gone. The king and his court saw the end coming. They packed up the treasury and fled, abandoning the city to its fate. They left the commoners behind. Shortly after the elite escaped, the city was torched. Who lit the match? It might have been the Sea Peoples, or the Kaska mountain tribes, or perhaps the starving citizens themselves, furious at their leader's cowardice. The result was the same. The walls of Hattusa, which had stood for 4 centuries, turned black with soot. The empire that ruled modern-day Turkey was erased from the map. The infection spread south to the coast of Syria, to the gleaming city of Ugarit. This brings us back to that clay tablet in the oven. Ugarit was the New York City of the Bronze Age, a cosmopolitan hub where every language was spoken and every currency was accepted. It was too rich to fall. It was too important to fail. But the letters found in the ruins of the House of Urtanu, a high-ranking official, reveal the terrifying speed of the collapse. As the enemy ships approached, the king of Ugarit, Amurapi, sent desperate messages to his allies. He wrote to the king of Al-Ashir on Cyprus, begging for news. The reply he received was chilling. "Be on the lookout, fortify your towns. Where are your troops and your chariots?" Hammurapi's response is one of the saddest documents in history. "My troops are in the land of the Hittites, and my ships are in Lycia. They have not yet returned." The global alliance system had backfired. Ugarit had sent its army to help the Hittites and its navy to help the Lycians. The city was defenseless. When the blow landed, it was total. There was no siege. There was only slaughter. The invaders breached the walls, looted the warehouses, and set the city on fire. The heat was so intense that limestone turned into powder. The survivors fled into the countryside, never to return. Ugarit was not rebuilt. It lay buried under the dirt for 3,000 years, a time capsule of a murdered city. The collapse of these giants created a vacuum. With the Hittites gone and the Levantine ports burning, the trade routes were severed. The flow of tin stopped completely. The bronze supply dried up. The lights of civilization were being snuffed out one by one. The wave of destruction continued south, rolling down the coast of Canaan like a tsunami. Ashdod, Ashkelon, Acre all destroyed. The sea peoples were gathering momentum, feeding off the ruins of the civilizations they crushed. They now controlled the land, they controlled the sea, and they turned their gaze toward the last obstacle standing between them and total domination: Egypt. The pharaoh Ramses III watched the world burn from his palace in Thebes. He knew they were coming. He knew that if Egypt fell, the history of the ancient world would end there. He began to mobilize every spear, every ship, and every chariot he had left. The final showdown was imminent. By 1177 BC, the entire Mediterranean world had gone dark. The Mycenaeans were gone. The Hittites were gone. The great trading hubs of the Levant were smoking ruins. Only Egypt remained. Pharaoh Ramses III knew he could not fight this enemy on the open sea. The sea peoples were superior sailors. Their ships were lighter, faster, and more maneuverable than the heavy Egyptian barges. To meet them in deep water would be suicide. So Ramses made a brilliant tactical decision. He wouldn't fight them on their turf. He would force them to fight on his. He allowed the invading fleet to enter the mouth of the Nile Delta. He let them think the gateway to Egypt was open. But the Nile is treacherous. Its channels are narrow, shallow, and lined with dense papyrus reeds. Ramses turned the geography of Egypt into a weapon. As the sea people's ships navigated the cramping waters, thousands of Egyptian archers rose from the reeds. A storm of arrows rained down on the invaders. On the banks, the pharaoh's soldiers used grappling hooks to drag the enemy ships toward the shore, capsizing them or boarding them to slaughter the crews in close quarters. The temple walls at Medinet Habu immortalize this moment in gruesome detail. You can see the chaos. Ships are overturned. Sea people's warriors are flailing in the water, pierced by arrows. Egyptian soldiers stand triumphantly on the piles of dead. Ramses III carved his victory speech into the stone with typical pharaonic humility. "Those who reached my boundary, their seed is not. Their hearts and their souls are finished unto all eternity." He had done the impossible. He had stopped the apocalypse. He defeated the force that had erased 8 other civilizations. He took thousands of prisoners, branding them with his name and settling them in strongholds in Canaan. Some of these captives, the Peliset, would eventually become known to history as the Philistines. But as the smoke cleared over the delta, the terrible reality set in. Egypt had won the battle, but it had lost the war. The victory was financially ruinous. Mobilizing the entire army and navy drained the treasury. More importantly, even though Egypt survived, its trading partners were dead. There was no one left to sell grain to. There was no one to buy gold from. The international network that fueled Egypt's economy had vanished. The consequences hit home almost immediately. A few years after this glorious victory, the scribes and artisans building the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings stopped working. They hadn't been paid their rations of grain. They marched to the funerary temples and sat down in protest, refusing to move until they were fed. This was the first recorded labour strike in human history. Think about the irony. Ramses III had just saved the world from the sea peoples, but he couldn't afford to feed his own tomb builders. The god king was bankrupt. The pharaonic authority, which had stood for 3,000 years, began to crack. Egypt didn't collapse overnight like the Hittites, but it entered a long, slow slide into irrelevance. It became a shadow of its former self, a hollow shell where priests fought over scraps of power while the sands encroached on the monuments. The Bronze Age was over. The heroes were dead, the palaces were burned, and the global economy was shattered. The survivors were left standing in the ashes, looking at a world that had suddenly become much smaller, much quieter, and much darker. When the fires finally burned themselves out, a strange silence fell over the Mediterranean. The great powers were gone. The diplomats were gone. The merchant ships were gone. Historians call the period that followed the Dark Ages, and for once the name isn't just dramatic, it is accurate. The population of Greece plummeted by perhaps as much as 75%. Think about that. 3 out of every 4 people were gone killed by war, starved by drought, or lost to migration. The survivors didn't live in palaces. They huddled in small, isolated hamlets, farming just enough to survive. The regression was terrifyingly absolute. The most chilling evidence of this ancient apocalypse is the loss of memory. In Greece, the Linear B script, which had been used to track the complex economy of the palaces, vanished. It wasn't just that people stopped writing. They forgot how to write. For nearly 400 years, the Greeks were illiterate. The oral tradition took over. Stories of the great age of heroes, of Achilles, of Odysseus, of Agamemnon, were passed down by bards around campfires because no one could write them down. When the Greeks finally learned to write again centuries later, using a new alphabet borrowed from the Phoenicians, they looked at the massive ruins of Mycenaean Tyrins with bewilderment. They looked at the limestone blocks weighing tons and couldn't conceive that their ancestors had the technology to lift them. So they invented a myth. They said, men didn't build this. One-eyed giants, the Cyclopes, built this. They had become squatters in the ruins of their own history. The quality of life collapsed. Pottery, which had once been decorated with vibrant octopuses and scenes of daily life, became simple and geometric. Fine jewellery disappeared. The international trade that brought lapis lazuli and ivory stopped dead. If you lived in a village in 1100 BC, your world ended at the horizon. You ate what you grew. You wore what you spun. The globalized world was a distant memory, a golden age that felt more like a fairy tale than history. But there is a paradox here. While the Dark Age was a disaster for the elite, it might have been a relief for the common man. The crushing tax burden of the palace economy was gone. The kings who demanded your grain and your sons for their wars were dead. The massive bureaucracy that counted every sheep and every jar of oil had evaporated. Archaeology shows us that while the big sites were abandoned, new, smaller settlements sprang up in the hills. These communities were poorer, yes, but they were also flatter. There was less inequality. The gap between the richest man and the poorest man in the village was a matter of a few cows, not a golden palace. The collapse had acted like a forest fire. It was destructive, terrifying, and lethal. It burned away the old growth, the rotting trunks of the Hittite and Mycenaean empires that blocked out the sun. But forest fires also clear the brush. They return nutrients to the soil. They create space. In the darkness of this collapsed world, deep in the ash, something new was waiting to germinate. A new technology was being adopted not out of choice, but out of necessity. The tin trade was dead, so bronze was impossible to make. The smiths needed a substitute. They turned to a metal that was uglier, harder to work with, but available everywhere. Iron. The end of one world was simply the violent birth pangs of the next. Necessity is the mother of invention, but in the ashes of 1177 BC, necessity was a matter of survival. The trade routes were dead. The tin from Afghanistan might as well have been on the moon. The smiths of the Mediterranean faced a crisis. They had copper, but without tin, they couldn't make bronze. They looked at their broken tools and defenseless villages and realized they had to adapt or die. They turned to the red dirt beneath their feet. Iron had been known to the ancients, but it was considered inferior, a novelty metal difficult to work with, requiring much higher temperatures than copper. But it had one supreme advantage. It was everywhere. You didn't need a global supply chain to find iron ore. You could dig it out of a bog in Greece or a hillside in Italy. The shift to the Iron Age was not just a technological upgrade, it was a political revolution. Bronze was an aristocratic metal. Because the ingredients were rare and expensive, the kings controlled the supply. They controlled who got a sword and who got a plough. Iron was democratic. Once the smiths mastered the difficult art of smelting and quenching, iron turning the soft bloom into hard steel. The monopoly of the palaces was shattered forever. A village blacksmith could now outfit a local militia. A farmer could forge a stronger ploughshare that could cut through heavier soil, opening up new lands for agriculture that bronze tools couldn't touch. This democratization of violence and production changed the nature of power. The era of the elite charioteer was over. The era of the infantryman, the common soldier armed with cheap, effective iron weapons, had begun. Out of the power vacuum left by the Egyptians and Hittites, new players emerged. On the coast of modern-day Lebanon, a group of survivors known as the Phoenicians looked at the empty seas and saw opportunity. They were the descendants of the Canaanites who hadn't been destroyed. They took to the waves, building a trade network that would dwarf the old Bronze Age routes, reaching as far as Britain and West Africa. But the Phoenicians brought something far more valuable than purple dye or cedar wood. They brought the ultimate tool of democratization, the alphabet. The old writing systems, Egyptian hieroglyphs, cuneiform, linear B, were complex, clunky beasts with hundreds of signs. You needed years of training to read them. This kept knowledge locked in the hands of a tiny guild of scribes. The Phoenicians, being practical merchants, needed something faster. They stripped writing down to just 22 sounds. This alphabet was a virus of knowledge. It was easy to learn. A merchant could learn it in weeks. A farmer could learn to sign his name. The Greeks borrowed it, added vowels, and suddenly literacy exploded. We often mourn the Bronze Age collapse as a tragedy. We mourn the lost frescoes and the fallen palaces, but step back and look at the timeline. If the Bronze Age hadn't collapsed, the rigid palace economies might have choked innovation for another 1,000 years. The collapse broke the stranglehold of the god kings. It allowed the small, the scrappy, and the innovative to rise. Without this collapse, the Israelites might have remained a minor tribe in the shadow of Egypt. Without this collapse, the Greek city-states, with their radical ideas about voting and philosophy, might never have formed in the vacuum left by Mycenae. The fire of 1177 BC burned down the old forest, yes, but it cleared the canopy for the saplings of the classical world to grow. The catastrophe was the crucible that forged the modern world. So why does any of this matter? Why should you care about a clay tablet baking in a kiln 3,000 years ago? Because when I look at the late Bronze Age, I don't see a primitive world. I see a mirror. We live in a civilization that is eerily similar to theirs. We are hyper-connected. We are globalized. We have achieved incredible levels of prosperity by optimizing our systems for efficiency. We have just-in-time supply chains that deliver food to our supermarkets and microchips to our factories hours before they are needed. But the lesson of 1177 BC is that complexity is not just a strength, it is a vulnerability. Think about the tin of our age. It might be semiconductors, it might be rare earth minerals. If a single factory in Taiwan shuts down, car production in Detroit stops. If a ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal, the exact same waterway Ramses III defended global trade loses billions of dollars a day. We have built a machine that is efficient but brittle. We also face the same horsemen of the apocalypse that rode down the Hittites. We are seeing the early tremors of climate instability. We are seeing the sea peoples of our time not invaders, but millions of displaced people forced to move because their homes are flooded or their fields are dry. We are seeing the internal rot of inequality, where the gap between the palace elites and the common reality grows wider, straining the social contract. The kings of Ugarit and Mycenae believed they were too big to fail. They thought their treaties and their gods would protect them. They were wrong. Civilization is not a permanent state of being. It is a fragile agreement. It is a Jenga tower that we build higher and higher, assuming it will never fall. But here is the difference. Here is the hope. The scribe in Ugarit didn't know why his world was ending. He didn't understand plate tectonics or global economics. He was writing in the dark. We are not in the dark. We have the receipts. We have the history. We know that when systems become too rigid, they break. We know that resilience is more important than efficiency. We have the capacity to adapt before the collapse, not just after. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't the end of humanity. We survived. We rebuilt. But it was a painful reset button that cost millions of lives and erased centuries of progress. The question facing us today isn't whether our system will face a crisis. It inevitably will. The question is whether we will bend like iron or shatter like bronze. If this deep dive into the ancient apocalypse gave you a new perspective on our own world, please destroy that like button. It helps the algorithm more than you know. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss our next journey into the forgotten corners of history. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Do you think our modern society is more resilient than the Bronze Age? Or are we making the same mistakes? I'll be reading your thoughts. Until next time, remember, the past is never dead. It's not even past.